back to the Certified Examiner training. We're going to go over the parallel parking section in this video. And if you've got your score sheet in front of you, it's right over here on the upper left section. We're going to cover just parallel parking in this one. First up, we'll start with the examples of the automatic disqualification, things that will end the test immediately. First up, anytime there's damage to property, it's scored as an accident. So whenever you bump into the other car, or if you cause damage to grass, if you go off the road or hit a mailbox or a garbage can that causes damage, not just bumping it, that's scored as an accident. End the test immediately. Drive back to the school in the shortest route possible. Anytime there's more than one tire over the curb, so 2 tires on the curb, score that as dangerous action. Anytime you have to intervene, either verbally telling them to stop so they don't hit the car, or hitting the brake, or putting the car in neutral, whatever you did, anytime you've got to stop the applicant from hitting a parked car or an approaching car, score that as a dangerous action. Anytime a car that's passing is forced to swerve into another lane or brake hard to stop, score that as a dangerous action. Make sure you catch those key words, forced to swerve or had to brake hard. Not just the typical irritated driver who didn't want to get behind someone else and got out of the way in a huff. Only if they're forced to swerve into another lane or brake hard due to your applicant's actions. Anytime if a car alarm goes off as a result of making physical contact, score it as an accident. In this case, even if there was no damage. Now keep in mind, some of these newer cars have a lot of automatic features to assist people with parallel parking. Just advise them you cannot use the automatic feature. You must manually parallel park the vehicle. You have to do it. And sometimes you'll have an applicant say, well, what if I just don't parallel park? I just don't want to. You just advise them they are required to complete the maneuver. Then you can move on to the next one. So first up, first error on parallel parking, the vision penalty. So anytime the applicant fails to use best possible vision when they're entering the space, leaving the space, or even within the parking space. Sometimes an applicant will be right up close to the car and they'll back up to get, they're already in the space, they back up a little bit more. They still need to turn around and primarily look out the rear window. And so for most of the maneuver, the customer should be turning and looking out the rear window, unless just the use of mirrors is best possible vision. So in case you're in an enclosed camper windowless van. This doesn't happen very often, but it does, and you've got to keep that in mind. Don't score vision if they don't have a rear window to look out. And again, anytime they fail to use best possible vision when leaving the parking space, you want to make sure a check of the blind spot to the left side is required. Sometimes applicants will use their peripheral vision. Okay. It has softened a little bit in the 2021 update, so it doesn't require a full chin to shoulder look like this. It's up to you to watch the applicant's eyes using the rear view mirror or whatever mirror you have, if you have an instructor mirror in the car you're using. Watch their eyes, because they may do a blind spot check with just their eyes, okay? And before re-entering a traffic for a second attempt, so if they're in the space, they go back out for a second attempt, a check of the blind spot is required. Now a second attempt is counted when 50% or more of the vehicle leaves the space. We'll have an illustration for you here in just a moment. If the applicant fails to use a turn signal properly when leaving parked position, not when arriving to the parked position. If that was required, that'd be scored under lane travel, which we'll cover in the lane travel video. So signal is scored when you're leaving the parking area when no signal or an improper signal is given. Sometimes an applicant will leave on the hazard lights and will re-enter traffic with the hazard lights on. That would be an improper signal because it does not indicate the direction you're traveling. This can also be scored if a hand signal is not given because the turn indicator cannot be readily observed by street traffic. This is rare, but if you're parallel parking in this situation and there's a giant truck behind you, the applicant is required to stick their arm out and give a hand signal so that it could possibly be seen by others on the street. If you're using stanchions, you may see this one. Contact. If there is bumper contact with another vehicle but no damage results, or if they strike a stanchion pole, which is more common, you'll score contact here. Now remember, damage to poles is not scored as an accident. So if you run over the pole and you flatten it and you break it in half, it's not scored as an accident. It's scored as contact. The through error. Again, many of us do not use stanchion poles for this maneuver, but if you do, and your applicant drives through the stanchion poles, like that, you'll circle through. Drives forward or backs through the stanchion poles. The curb penalty under danger potential is if you back over the curb with one wheel. So if you remember on backing maneuver, the 4-point curb penalty was for striking the curb or one tire up on the curb. In this case, in parallel parking, it's only one tire up on the curb. Now remember, if there's damage to property, it's scored as an accident and the test ends. And if you get more than one wheel over the curb, stop the applicant, scored as a dangerous action for 2 tires on the curb, and the test ends. Return immediately to the school in the shortest route possible. Unable is kind of a tricky one. So I've had some back and forth with the Department of Licensing annually over what this penalty means, and we've never really gotten a consistent answer. Finally, after many years of debate with the great Ted Larson, one of the Department of Licensing auditors for many years, who wrote the manual, translated it from the technical manual on the License Service Office side. After much back and forth, we finally concluded that unable, besides being what you see here, score the applicant after they've made 2 attempts to park and still not properly parked. What does it mean to not be properly parked? We've decided that it's not parked in the space. If the car is parked in the space, you're going to use one of the other ones here, distance and center. For now, they're unable to park in the space. Mark was unable, move on. Now, if the customer does not back in, right, they pull forward into the space, that just means the instructions were not understood. Give them additional instructions and allow a second attempt. So you can explain a little more besides the instructions you just give, right? You just gave them, just give them additional instruction. You can say other words. Let them try again. Remember to score all errors up to that point, which is basically just distance, center, jockeying, and try. Okay, and hitting the curb, of course. Road, your final one on danger potential, final 4-point penalty. If the applicant positions the vehicle so the passenger side wheels are past the poles, as if they were on a curb, but there is no curb present, so just off the road. Okay, so it's just past the poles. You may never score this, especially if you don't use stanchions. Now remember, when you're parking between poles or the stanchions, you're not required to use the left arm signal when re-entering traffic. Right? Remember earlier we had the signal where if you were parked in front of a large truck that obscures the vision of your turn signals, you'd have to use a left arm signal. But if you're doing the stanchions, it's not required. On to the lack of skill penalties on this line, just 2-point penalties for these. The 2-point curb penalty is when the applicant strikes the curb when attempting to park, which stops vehicle movement. The wheel does not go over the curb, so this is a curb strike. Only 2 points on parallel parking. Now here's the thing to keep in mind. If you can barely feel contact, just make sure the car is just touching it rather than having been stopped by the curb. If you're not sure, don't score it. Remember, if it's a gentle scrape that occurs, it did not stop the progress of the car, don't score it. 1.5 is when the applicant fails to park within that designated 1.5 car lengths. You allow them about 30 feet. So if you're using a small car like a Corolla, that's about 14 feet long or so. So you can basically have the space of 2 Corollas to work with. So if the applicant backs over to the space where the imaginary second car would have been, you'll score 1.5. Now this also counts when parking or when the applicant is getting ready to leave the parking space. So they back over it on the way out, score 1.5. So it is possible you could score it twice. on the way in and on the way out. And if they're jockeying within the space, you could score it again as well. Jockeying can be a little tricky, so I'm going to try to go through this slowly for you. That is excessive jockeying by the customer, moving back and forth. These are put in red letters for a reason, within the space, so the space behind the car. Okay, so if they're adjusting the car on the outside, like the yellow car is in position now, if they're adjusting the car just to get up, line up to a better position, you don't score any of those moves because they're not within the space, which is space behind the car. So you score this if more than 3 moves are made entering or leaving. So that looks like a reverse, forward, forward again is going to be the 4th move. You would score jockeying at this point. So when counting your moves, use gear changes as an indicator of each move. So shifting from drive and reverse counts as 1 move. But remember, do not combine moves with those made back into the space with those made to leave the space or additional attempts to park. So when they re-enter traffic, it's not counted as a move. If they go back out for another try because they're just having trouble and they go back out and try again, don't count that. You restart the jockey counter for a second attempt. So while parking, the applicant moves the vehicle 6 times in the space. Stop the maneuver, score everything you see, instruct the applicant to re-enter traffic, and continue the test. And basically all you're going to see is distance and center, which we'll cover here next. So what is a try? A try is when the applicant makes more than 1 attempt to back from the travel portion of the road. Now they've got to get at least half the car into the space to be considered an attempt. So they bring the car in, and they don't like what they see, and they bring the car back out. That's a try. Now remember, they have to signal and look over their shoulder whenever they re-enter traffic, bring half the car out, right? Now remember, and the applicant may ask you, can I try again? Your answer should be yes. You are not supposed to prompt them to try again. If they ask if they're allowed to, yes. Just that simple. Now remember, if a second attempt is made, all those deductions made on either attempt are scored. So if they hit the curb, come back out, try again, hit the curb again, you're scoring both those curb bumps. A second attempt is made for that maneuver location only. Okay, attempting a second parallel park at another location is not permitted. There is an exception for this. I want you to read the examiner guidelines to see what that is. This one here. And if the applicant does not back in, so in other words, if they drive through the cones up, parallel parking means the instructions are not understood, the scoring is not counted, you can allow a second attempt at another location. So if they don't back out, this is your choice. If you feel like they can't get back into the correct position to start over again, you can have them do it again somewhere else. Distance. So after they're done with the maneuver, they've parked the car. They did not park within 12 inches from the curb, the passenger side, poles, or the edge of the road. Now, if they're back up in the beginning, right next to the blue car, and they park it up there, it's not properly parked because they're not within the space. Don't score distance, score this as unable. So if you have the stanchion poles out, remember if you have a very small car, it's completely inside the space, but still more than 12 inches from the curb poles or the edge of the road, those will be scored even though they may not be out in a lane of traffic. Now remember how to tell if you're about 12 inches away from the curb, that's kind of a visual approximation. But you know how the sidewalk spills over a little bit and some of that material is out in the road? That's about 12 inches from the curb. So your tires really need to be right next to that line or on them. The last one on here is center. If the applicant fails to center the vehicle properly and is too far forward or back. So if they're too far to that blue car, score centered. They're right next to that red car, score centered. They're somewhere in between there. Remember, you want the penalties to be significant. You don't need to get ticky-tack on this. You might not score centered. As long as you don't want to be able to squeeze another small car between you and the other car you're parking between. Okay, next up, park and start on a hill. We'll see you then.